The year is 1959, and NASCAR is taken to the high banks of Daytona for the first time in the sport's history. NASCAR legends like Lee Petty, Tim Flock, Rex White, and Tiny Lund all prepare for the first sanctioned race on the oval. However, one driver that day, starting 18th in the 1959 Daytona 500 qualifier, would make his first ever start in the NASCAR Cup Series. A driver by the name of Eduardo Dibos, born in Lima, Peru on June 22, 1927. Eduardo was born to the father Eduardo Dibos Demerit, a two-time mayor of Lima, Peru, the largest city in the country. Today, his father actually has a sports arena named after him, but his son, full name Eduardo Dibos Chapias, grew up in the mayoral mansion. He delved into youthful interests. Motor racing seemed to fill the void the best, and through the youthful excitement in his life, pursued an education at the Institute of Massachusetts, garnering a degree in engineering. Once he returned back to Peru in the early 1950s, his father had just stepped away from being the mayor of Lima. During this time, he would find his wife, who they would have 10 children with throughout their marriage. He also began running local motorsports events, building his name and slowly becoming one of the country's biggest motor racing stars. As with any athlete in South America, they became renowned and a superstar among the people. He used some of his name recognition to get Jim Rathman to come to Peru in 1958 and run the Atacongo circuit, where he won outright. 2 years later, Jim Rathman would go on to win the Indianapolis 500, whilst Eduardo would also pursue racing up north as well. He would go just above the equator into the US, hearing of a place that would be hosting what was supposed to be the biggest stock car race in the world. It was the first time he entered the high banks of Daytona International Speedway, and he found instant awe in the facility. He partnered with team owner Van Acker and brung fellow Peruvian driver Raul Salonas. The two would attempt their first ever Daytona 500 together, with the sponsor of the entire country of Peru. As mentioned before, he started 18th that day in the Daytona 500 qualifier, and drive all the way up to 5th by the finish of the race. The performance would earn him a spot in the first Daytona 500, beating the eventual race winner Lee Petty in the qualifying event. Dibos would inevitably finish 48th in the actual race, losing a transmission 44 laps into the event, whilst Raul Salonas would actually finish 12th in the event, driving the number 38 Ford T-Bird, and Dibos driving the 37. Later on, Eduardo would come back in July with that same number, and finish 5th in the inaugural Firecracker 400. Dibos, though, would never run a cup race again, even though he had moderate success in 3 starts. It didn't mean, though, his racing career stopped there. He would continue racing into the early 60s, where he would meet Italian driver Mario Calabattisti, a former motorcycle racer from the 1930s. He had won multiple class championships in his country, and success made him one of the top drivers for the Scuderia Ferrari motorcycle team. During the winters in the 1930s, he also began bobsled racing, where he also won championships in that as well. However, the Italian racing star, in his ascent, suffered a near-fatal accident in the late 1930s, which ended his competitive racing days. On top of that, during his recovery, the start of World War II began, and for over a decade, his racing dreams came to a screeching halt. By the late 1950s, racing was much of an afterthought for Mario. He met and married his wife in Peru and moved to the country, acquiring citizenship. And while starting a family, he met Eduardo Dibos. He talked him into picking back up the helmet and goggles, and into the 1960s they went. Mario and Eduardo ran multiple sports car circuit events together. The two eventually purchased a Ferrari 250 GT SWB together, nowadays one of the rarest collector cars in the world. And Eduardo would also help found the Peruvian Institute of Educational Development, along with the ACP, the Automobile Club of Peru. He would act as the club's first president. And on the racing side, they would build up the team and eventual racing empire that would attempt the 1964 Daytona 24. At the time, the event was 2,000 kilometers, and he and Mario would finish 10th in class. A very good drive for a team from Peru, and with a co-driver who was nearly 20 years out of the sport and 52 years old. Over the next few years, though, the drivers began to step away from driving duties, leaving them to people they hired, their racing aspirations slowly fading away little by little. In 1966, he did found the Caminos del Inca rally race in Peru, the most prestigious rally race in the country, 1,500 kilometers across the majority of it. But another aspiration for Eduardo came in something potentially just as dangerous as being a race car driver: politics. After the death of co-team owner Mario Catabilisti in a motorsports event in Peru during the late 1960s, going to stop the video here just for a second, just to correct something here. Mario Catabilisti actually didn't die in a motorsports event in Peru. He actually died at the Daytona National Speedway. His death has actually never been officially recorded as happening on the racetrack or during the 1969 Rolex 24. In this photo I'm showing here, it's pretty apparent he died in the twilight hours of the race, which is kind of surprising because I just did a video about a year and a half ago on every life that has been lost at Daytona National Speedway. I didn't know that this was someone who also passed here, so rest in peace, Mario Catabilisti. Eduardo, whether his choice or not, entangled himself in one of the most hectic political situations you could find yourself in. Peru, since its independence in the mid-19th century, had always had flare-ups of instability. The War of the Pacific it had with Chile in the back half of the 19th century did not help the country establish a strong central government. The problem always seemed to persist of poverty, coupled with the higher powers having too much. But the template of the country's economic system never seemed to be officially decided on. The Civilista Party, who held control throughout the 20th century, wanted free trade and commerce, whilst the Democratic Party, a far more nationalistic group, bolstered by impoverished Peruvians, forged a path to Peru's first independent coup d'etat. In between 1910 and 1970, 5 overthrows of the government would occur, with the 5th one involving our very own Eduardo Dibos Chapias. In a dispute over the precious Peruvian oil fields, the government headed by President Fernando Belaunde hid precious information from the people in regards to their deals with the international oil companies. The scandal fueled doubt in the government, and General Commander of Peru, Juan Velasco Alvarado, had enough. At 1 a.m. on October 3, 1968, the turrets of the Peruvian military turned against the government it had promised to defend. The presidential palace was surrounded, and not a single bullet was fired, as every guard dropped their guns. By 2 a.m., President Belaunde was dragged out of his bed by Alvarado himself and told the commander that he had forfeit without contest. With that, the revolutionary government of armed forces reigned over Peru, with Velasco as leader. No elections were held in 1970, and he appointed Eduardo Dibos the mayor of Peru. Eduardo had involved himself in a government highly disliked by many of the world's stronger powers. At a time where the Cold War held strong in much of the countries, Velasco, expressing communistic sympathy and leanings in his speeches, along with his authoritarian rule, did not bode well with the relationship between he and the U.S. Velasco strived to template himself and his people off of Fidel Castro, and Eduardo Dibos helped inaugurate a donation that was made to the Peruvian people, which celebrated their independence. The donation came from China. There's a piece of art called the Chinese Arch, which was endorsed and made directly from Chinese Communist Party leader Mao Zedong. Along with Velasco's land reclamation plan, Eduardo used the repossessed lands to build a system of roadways to enhance access to the coast. And in the middle of his reign, Eduardo would die from a heart attack at the age of 46 on October 15th, 1973. He would actually pass away in Munich, Germany, there on business travel. As for Velasco and the authoritarian dictatorship he was a part of, the relationships only soured between he and U.S. modernized countries. The capturing of American fishing boats, declaring the U.S. and Canada as terrorist organizations, and planning to wage war on Chile in revenge for the lands they lost in the War of the Pacific a century earlier, did not bode well with many allies across the entire world. He also spent over $25 billion in modern value on militaristic strength, whilst the poverty issue only worsened. It got so bad the U.S. sent Henry Kissinger to try to defuse the bomb, with the result of the meeting being that if Chile and Peru went to war, the US would send troops to Chile in a similar situation as the Vietnam War. Thankfully, none of that never happened, and Velasco was overthrown in 1975. The government he reestablished officially fell in 1980, and as for Eduardo Dibos Chapias, he became the first Latin American driver in NASCAR, but also became a crucial part of an authoritarian dictatorship.